Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Top 10 Accessibility Resolutions presentation. My name is Dennis DeYoung, and I am a Business Relations Specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. I'm excited to be co-hosting today with my colleague, Julie Wood. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about today's presentation?
Sure, Dennis, thank you. Hi, everyone. We are very happy to have you joining us today. My name is Julie Wood. I'm an occupational therapist and OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. One of the services I provide in my role are educational presentations, and throughout 2020, we have delivered a variety of webinars, all of which that have been geared toward supporting employers in creating workplaces that are diverse and inclusive of employees with disabilities. And so today is our final webinar of the year, and it's called the Top 10 Accessibility Resolutions. And it's really a collection of our best practices that we wanted to highlight from our previous trainings this year. And so we will touch on some concepts you've heard before, and we are going to introduce one new topic to share with you today. And we just thought this would be a fun way to wrap up a year that's been challenging in many ways for all of us. And that would also give us ideas to inspire our continued and collective efforts to make work sites more accessible and inclusive in 2021. At the end of the webinar today, I will make an announcement about the 2021 virtual webinar series. And I also have a fun voluntary challenge for everyone, so please stick around until the end to learn more about that.
Thanks, Julie. I'm excited to hear about the challenge. So before we get started with the countdown for the top 10 accessibility resolutions, I would like to stop and share a couple of available resources. So if you have not been able to attend all of our live webinars this past year and you'd like to, there are archived versions available on the employers page of the OOD website, and these are all listed in the resource section of the learner's guide for today's webinar. Today's training also comes with the same resources. It has the PowerPoints that you're seeing in front of you, the learner's guide and fact sheets, and those cover the top 10 accessibility resolutions, budget, and the reasonable accommodation statement. Now, if you'd like to access these now, there is a link posted in the Q&A section of Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice, but we do hope this information is helpful for you. Now, we will be stopping a few times during the presentation to answer questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A box at any time so they're ready for us when we stop. And with that, let's begin our countdown and start with accessibility resolution number 10. Prepare job descriptions with essential functions. Julie, I've heard you say before that a job description is not required under Title I of the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, but that it is a best practice. Can you tell us why?
Yes, Dennis, I chose to highlight job descriptions as an accessibility resolution because all applicants rely on these as a screening tool to decide if they're qualified for the job. So as an employer, you want to attract as many qualified applicants as you can for your open positions, and that includes attracting qualified applicants with disabilities. So to provide an applicant with the best understanding of what the job requires, the job description should include the essential functions of the job and also be written using inclusive language. Because applicants use job descriptions to decide if they're qualified, it's a good idea to create these before you advertise or interview for the job.
Thanks, Julie. So you mentioned including the job's essential functions, which are those main tasks the job was created to perform, and also to write those using inclusive language.
That's correct. So how a job description is written matters because it conveys what tasks an employee has to perform. It's best to create a job description that uses inclusive language and that also describes the outcome of the job task rather than the customary way the task is performed. So first, I'd like to talk about what inclusive language is. This means we use plain language, which is language that is clear and concise. It uses words that have one meaning instead of multiple meanings, and it avoids using jargon, technical terms, proprietary names, and really just terms or phrases that aren't necessary. And it's also best to describe the job's outcome instead of the customary way the job has always been done. And so I'd like to share an example of what I mean by that and why it's important. So for example, if you're hiring a sales executive and one of the job's essential functions is to meet with clients daily on site at their locations to discuss their buying needs, we want to think about how to phrase that. And so maybe the previous sales executive drove her own vehicle to meet with clients. And so maybe the previous job description was described with the essential functions saying the sales executive must drive to client locations daily. In making this more inclusive, we want to think about what the outcome is of this essential function. So the goal for this sales executive is to communicate with clients on a daily basis to discuss their buying needs. There might be more than one way to do that. So if the job in fact requires meeting on site with the client, a more inclusive way to write this essential function is the sales executive must travel to client locations daily. Now, when an individual with a disability that impacts the ability to drive reviews this essential function, she will feel qualified because she knows there are multiple ways to travel, and she could use public transportation or a ride share to meet with clients daily. So by rewriting the essential function in this way, we now open this job up to attract more qualified candidates to consider for the job.
Well, those are certainly some helpful tips to know about job descriptions. And I know there is more to know about this topic. And for that additional information, we invite you to view our previous training called Inclusive Hiring, Applicants with Disabilities. Okay, on to the next accessibility resolution, number 9. No available resources and support network. Julie, I know our employer partners strive to create work environments that are accessible and to provide reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities when needed. And just as a reminder, a reasonable accommodation is a change in the workplace that enables an employee with a disability to access the environment, perform the job, or enjoy a privilege of employment. Now, I imagine there are times employers face challenges in finding solutions and are curious to know what outside resources and support are available to them.
That's exactly why I included this as an accessibility resolution, because there will be times you face a challenge with identifying an effective, reasonable accommodation. And there really are a lot of resources out there to help you select an effective solution. We don't want you to feel as an employer that you are on your own to figure this out, because we are all in this together. And so we have put together some resources to help employers identify and implement reasonable accommodations.
So Julie, as you've said before in other trainings, often when an employer has received a request for a reasonable accommodation and is engaged in the interactive process with the employee with a disability, the two parties are able to identify an effective solution. And you've said the best place to start is with asking the employee what he or she thinks will work, because they likely already know. But when this is not the case, what outside sources are available for employers?
Well, there are several, and the good news is there is no cost for any of these resources that I am going to share with you. So first, and with permission, you could ask the employee's medical provider for recommendations. This professional might know of some ideas for effective solutions or could offer some comments on a reasonable accommodation that you are both considering. Next, when you are in the interactive process talking with the employee, you could mention our services here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. Our services are voluntary, they're confidential, There's no cost. And what we aim to do is provide Ohioans with disabilities the services and support they need to find or keep a job. And so if the employee is interested, he or she could apply for services through our website at www.oodworks.com, or they could call us on the phone at 1-800-282-4535. Once they are eligible, they are then paired with a vocational rehabilitation counselor who can identify what the employee needs by offering customized assessments and having one-on-one meetings. So in addition to that, there are also 2 federal resources that both employers and employees can consult with for ideas on reasonable accommodations and also for questions about disability employment matters. And these are the Job Accommodation Network, which you know as JAN, and also the ADA National Network. The ADA National Network has 10 regional centers, and Ohio is in the Great Lakes region. So if you have a question and you're going to reach out, you would want to reach out to the Great Lakes region. But I did want to share that all of these networks have free training and webinars that you can take, and they also have very helpful resources on their website. So it's a good idea to be familiar with all of the regional centers. And then the last resource I'd like to share is Ohio's Bureau of Workers' Compensation. They also offer no-cost services for all employers. And these include things like safety consultations, ergonomic resource guides, training classes, and safety videos. And all of these are specific to a variety of industries, so you really can customize the solutions that they're offering. And they are more geared toward safety and prevention. However, sometimes when we look at our environments that way, we're able to identify the barriers that are in the workplace and then identify solutions to remove these barriers, which helps to make the work environment more accessible for everyone.
Those are really great resources to know about and to consult with. And we have included the contact information for all of these in the Learner's Guide. Now, Julie, I imagine there are times when a reasonable accommodation has been identified. However, it may not be clear whether or not it will be effective.
Dennis, that is actually very true. Prior to joining OOD, I worked as a practicing occupational therapist, and I worked in the vocational setting. And so I traveled to where people worked to provide evaluations, on-site therapy, and to conduct ergonomic assessments that helped identify reasonable accommodations. And on many occasions, the accommodations that we implemented worked perfectly. But other times we did have some trial and error that was involved before we found the right solution. And that's just the reality of it. Sometimes you're not going to know if something will work until you try it out in the work environment. And so the next resource that I would like to share with you is a lending library. Lending libraries are available throughout the state, and they may have the item that you're considering as an accommodation available for you to borrow and use in the work environment first. And so the libraries that we're familiar with are included in the Learner's Guide. That includes the Assistive Technology of Ohio Device Lending Library through the Ohio State University. OCALI, which is the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence, also has a lending library. And then the Ohio Developmental Disabilities Council put together a guide of a variety of technology lending programs throughout the state. Now, the kind of items that you might find available through these lending libraries include items like magnifiers, braille displays, alternative keyboards and mouse options, smart pens, and speech generating devices. And so these are good resources to become familiar with and learn what types of items they have available. Certainly, they're not going to have every item that you ever want to try out, but it is worth checking to see what they do have. So again, this information is in the Learner's Guide.
Thanks, Julie. I appreciate you talking about lending libraries. I know they can be a really great resource for employers. So let me shift now to the topic of reasonable accommodations and cost. I know we cite studies that show over half of reasonable accommodations are free, and when they're not, the typical cost is $500 or less. But there are times the cost is higher, and we know that an employer's assessment of whether that cost causes an undue hardship, they consider the net cost of the accommodation after applying any tax benefits that are eligible that they are eligible to receive, and after considering outside funding sources.
Right, and so that's the next type of resource I want to share because we do discuss this topic often with employers. And so I regularly look for information on funding for employers to help with the portion of an accommodation that might be considered unreasonable. And so I will share with you what I am aware of and what I have found. The Assistive Technology Industry Association has put together an AT resources funding guide, and this includes organizations, federal and state programs, and advocacy groups that all have ideas on funding that you could consider. The Internal Revenue Service, which is the IRS, has a collection of tax benefits for businesses who have employees with disabilities. For example, the Work Opportunity Tax Credit is available for eligible employers that hire individuals with disabilities. And the Disabled Access Credit is available for eligible small businesses, and the intention of this credit is to help offset the cost of reasonable accommodations, including those that might recur, such as sign language interpretation. The Job Accommodation Network also offers an article on funding, and it includes resources for both employers and individuals. And then again, here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, we offer services for eligible Ohioans with disabilities to help find or keep a job. And so at times we can help to identify the effective solution through our large provider network. And at times we can also help with purchasing accommodations to help an individual either access the hiring process or get started on the job or retain a job they already have. And it's not discussed as often, but an employee can be asked to pay the portion that has been determined an undue hardship for an employer after you've done a proper assessment of whether there is another reasonable accommodation available and after you've considered the outside funding sources that you might be eligible for.
Well, Julie, that's a great collection of resources for employers to consider for some of the costs associated with providing accommodations. And Julie, I know there's one more resources you wanted to suggest to employers.
Yes, Dennis, there is. And this is the resource you create yourself. So it can be helpful to be proactive in identifying vendors that offer some of the common services that you might receive a request for, such as a sign language interpreter or live captioning. Now, you may not have been asked for this kind of an accommodation yet, but it is a common request to receive. And if you have this list of vendors already put together, then it will be especially helpful for you in the event a qualified applicant that you have invited for an interview makes a request for a sign language interpreter. You'll be able to be better prepared to handle this request quickly and efficiently because you've already done your homework and put this information together to help you coordinate obtaining the service.
Thanks, Julie, and thank you for sharing all of those resources. Okay, on to the next accessibility resolution, number 8. Expand recruiting sources. Julie, in our previous trainings, we have cited studies that reveal employees with disabilities perform as well or better than employees without disabilities, and are absent less and stay in the job longer than employees without disabilities. And so these results demonstrate that hiring and retaining qualified and talented employees with a disability is a good business decision. Now, many employers want to tap into this valuable talent source. So how can employers attract qualified candidates with disabilities?
Dennis, we hear from employers that they are competing for a limited pool of qualified candidates. And so when an employer expands their hiring pool to include candidates with disabilities, they increase the number of qualified candidates they have to consider for the job. And as you referenced, these studies do show it's a good business decision to hire qualified candidates with disabilities. And so this is why we've included this as one of our accessibility resolutions. And so I have 2 strategies to consider when you expand your recruiting efforts that I would like to share. The first strategy is to expand your efforts to include sources of qualified candidates with disabilities. So this means recruit where candidates with disabilities are looking for jobs and can access the job posting. Here at OOD, we can support your efforts by sourcing qualified candidates with disabilities for your open positions. And so if you are not already partnering with us so we can do that, please reach out to us here or contact the business relations specialist in your area to learn more about being an employer partner. We've included the contact information for the business relations specialist team along with the counties they serve, so you know which one to contact in your area. The next strategy to consider is to make sure your job announcements are inclusive and accessible. This will eliminate any barriers that might prevent qualified applicants with disabilities from accessing the information about your open job positions. And so some of the ways you can do this includes providing information on the job's essential functions, so you're attracting qualified applicants. And you'll remember we talked earlier about how to write these using inclusive language and to make sure they're outcome-based. You also could provide an equal opportunity employer statement and make sure that's easy to find. And then post the information about the job in locations that are physically accessible, and make sure your online postings are also accessible, such as being able to be read by a screen reader. If you are including a phone number in the job posting, then be prepared to communicate through an accessible format, such as using a telephone relay service, and be prepared to provide any written information about the job posting in an alternative format upon request. So that could include something like audio or a large print format. We delivered a webinar earlier in the year called Inclusive Hiring, and it focused on applicants with disabilities. And so we have more information on this topic in that training if you would like to reference that archive on our website.
Julie, those are great tips for recruiting qualified candidates with disabilities. Okay, on to our next accessibility resolution, number 7. Develop a budget for reasonable accommodations. So Julie, this is a new topic I don't think we've addressed in our previous trainings. I imagine having a budget in place is a very helpful strategy for employers.
You're right, Dennis. We haven't talked about this before, and I decided to include this as an accessibility resolution because some employers have created a budget to streamline the process for purchasing accommodations, and it has become a best practice. The kind of budget I'm referring to is called a centralized accommodation fund, and it's known as a CAF. What it is an enterprise-wide fund that creates a single process for purchasing reasonable accommodation products and services, and it can be very helpful with hiring and retaining qualified employees with disabilities. The reason it's so important is because it can eliminate the concern that hiring managers and supervisors have that the cost of an accommodation is going to come directly from their department's operating budget. Both the Disability In organization and the Job Accommodation Network offer resources with best practices for creating this type of budget, and their information that they share includes the experiences and some testimonials from employers who have already implemented a CAF. So one resource shared that they conducted a survey of 180 employers, and it revealed that 34% of the employers have a company-wide CAF. And so we wanted to share with you what some of these employers had to say about their budget. Aetna said the centralized accommodations budget ensures that cost is not a limiting factor in identifying and implementing accommodation solutions. What I like about this testimonial is that often the cost of, or the perceived cost of an accommodation is a barrier. We believe it's going to cost a lot, and so that can prevent us from wanting to provide accommodations, and so having this budget in place can help to offset that barrier. A company by the name of Booz Allen Hamilton said covering all accommodation costs through centralized funding removes any concerns about cost impact to individual team or department budgets. And so that references what we mentioned earlier about hiring managers and supervisors being concerned that the cost of the accommodation will come out of their budget. And then Northrop Grumman said a centralized accommodations budget has been established to cover the costs of accommodations so that requests are made without hesitation. What I really like about this testimonial is that this means providing accommodations has infiltrated into the culture within this company. And so employees feel comfortable to ask for what they need because they know that there's a budget for this and that the employer is on board with providing accommodations. And so that's a really great testimonial.
Thanks, Julie. I love that last point. And boy, those are powerful testimonials. So what kinds of reasonable accommodations are employers using this budget for?
Well, that's going to be unique to each employer because everybody's work environment is different. But what some of the employers who were asked about said that they're using this budget to purchase includes things like sign language interpretation, assistive technology items, adjustable height desks, ergonomic chairs, and then facility modifications that you might make to make the environment more accessible for everyone.
So, Julie, I'm curious, how much money should an employer include in their budget or their CAF?
And that's another question where the answer is going to be unique for each employer. And so each employer is going to want to do their own assessment to determine this. But the resources I consulted with did share a couple of examples of how other employers arrived at this decision. And so I'll share those now. One company with 22,000 employees set their budget at $300,000, and they based this on a pilot project they did with employees in a specific geographic area. Another company with more than 65,000 employees based their budget on 6% of the employees of one sector requesting an accommodation. Now, I realize these quick statements don't give you all of the details of how these employers did this assessment and arrived at these numbers, but it at least conveys to us that there are different ideas and ways of determining this. When I've talked with employers in the past, what I have suggested is to simply look at what you've spent on accommodations over the past 5 to 10 years and then calculate an annual average and just start there.
Thanks, Julie. Those sound like some great ideas for employers to start with. I know a couple of major retailers that I've worked with have used tax incentives to fund their disability and inclusion programs, specifically the Work Opportunity Tax Credit. And just as a reminder, again, we have included a link to the IRS website in the Learner's Guide. So Julie, what are some of the best practices for creating this kind of budget that employers could consider?
Well, certainly how to create and use a centralized accommodations fund will be unique for each employer, but sometimes when we understand what other employers have done, it can help to inform our own process for evaluating and determining how we will use this kind of budget. The Job Accommodation Network resource did summarize some best practices for creating a centralized accommodation fund, and they based these best practices on an interview they did with 2 employers that already have this kind of budget. And so I'll share a few of these best practices with you now. The first one is to obtain executive level commitment, which we know is always helpful for any enterprise-wide project that you want to be successful. And the second is to create a team to develop and implement the budget and include all of these parties from the start and make sure to communicate to all parties why this is being created. And then the next step is to identify those best practices that are available for us from industry leaders who have already done this. And so consult with the resources that I've shared in the Learner's Guide. Again, this just informs your process so you can pick and choose and implement what makes sense for your workplace. Another best practice is to identify the accommodation items and services that you'd like to cover through this fund. And again, that will be unique to your business. I, with my consultative services as the Worksite accessibility specialist, have talked with employers in the past to help identify some potential barriers that are in the work environment, and then provided information on some general ways that either a reasonable accommodation could remove the barrier or how making the work environment more accessible could remove those barriers for all employees. It's also important to track accommodations with technology, and that can be just as simple as using an Excel spreadsheet. But when you track what you're doing with the process, it helps to inform your process so that it becomes even more efficient and effective for you over time. And then the final best practice is to make a decision about how purchases will be made through the accommodations fund. So some employers have decided a certain dollar amount can be automatically purchased without extra approval, and a dedicated credit card has been provided to do that. And so this can help to keep the process going instead of slowing it down. And so you're providing and implementing these accommodations effectively.
Well, you've certainly given us some great information to consider for creating a centralized budget for accommodations. Okay, on to the next accessibility resolution, number 6. Create a reasonable accommodation process. We've discussed many times that Title I of the ADA requires covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations for qualified applicants and employees with disabilities during the hiring process and employment, unless the accommodation causes an undue hardship. And we know that employers identify and implement reasonable accommodations by engaging in the interactive process when they collaborate together with the applicant or employee who has made the request for the accommodation. This accessibility resolution is addressing the reasonable accommodation process. So Julie, are employers required to create a formal process?
No, Dennis, they're not required to. Neither the ADA or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the EEOC, and also the entity who enforces the ADA, neither of these require the employer to create a formal process for requesting or providing reasonable accommodations. The EEOC just requires the employer and the employee engage in that informal collaboration that is known as the interactive process that you referenced. So they're working together to identify an effective solution. However, creating a formal process has really become a best practice, and it helps to make sure accommodation requests are received and acted upon quickly. So having a process can help to effectively and efficiently facilitate accommodations all the way through, so there isn't a breakdown in the process. And so that's why we've included this as an accessibility resolution. We do have an archived training called Navigating the Reasonable Accommodation Process. And in that training, we reviewed a process created by the Job Accommodation Network. We also looked at other resources. And so we organized the reasonable accommodation process into 8 steps to help employers navigate providing accommodations. We also shared resources in that training from the Job Accommodation Network that includes examples of forms and policies other employers have created for their process that might give you ideas for improving your process or helping you to create a new one. And so if you didn't have a chance to attend that training, you can access it from our website.
Great, that training is a very helpful resource. Okay, we're going to take our first break and see what questions have come in. So Julie, our first question, since we are working more from home these days, how would you recommend employers create the best description now for working from home, since there are many coworkers in this home setting, pets, kids, and other family?
Okay, so it sounds like that's asking about how to write the job description more inclusively because the work has maybe changed and it's remote.
That's correct.
Okay, so in our training that we have archived on inclusive hiring for applicants with disabilities, we go into developing job descriptions, what the components are in a lot more detail. But in that training and also in the resources section of this learner's guide, we included a chart from the PACE University that gives us the kind of the customary way that we have described jobs in the past, and then gives us a list of options for ways to use more inclusive words. So again, we are opening that up for more qualified candidates to know that they're qualified to do the job. And so what I would recommend is looking at how your job description is written now, and then compare it with that chart and see if there is a way to describe the job better, but maybe also looking at the job to see are there new duties or essential functions involved because this is a remote position now and maybe something about it is different.
That makes sense. Thanks, Julie. And then our next question is OOD able to help employers determine how much money they should include in an accommodation budget?
So what our role is, and this is through the Worksite accessibility services that we offer, I can consult with employer partners to talk more specifically about your accommodations process or what you've provided in the past and help identify in more detail some of what the best practices are from the resources that we have looked into to help you arrive at what is the best way to have this budget or the amount of money you should have in it or what it should include. And so we could certainly partner with resources to present to you so that you're able to make a more informed decision about how to use your budget best.
Great, thank you. And that's all the questions we have time for right now. So we are ready, Julie, for accessibility resolution number 5. Train on reasonable accommodation and disability awareness. Julie, I know through our efforts at OOD, we offer training on a variety of topics that are all geared towards supporting employers in creating work environments that are inclusive of employees with disabilities and that are accessible for everyone. The training that employers offer to their employees is also beneficial in these efforts, and you've identified 3 types of training to highlight today.
Dennis, I wanted to include training as an accessibility resolution because it really can be helpful in raising awareness. And like you said, it can inform those efforts to make work environments inclusive and accessible. The 3 kinds of trainings I wanted to highlight for employers are training that you provide for all employees on their right to reasonable accommodation, training for supervisors on reasonable accommodation requests, and then also training for all employees on disability etiquette and awareness.
Great. So Julie, can you tell us about the first one, training for all employees on their right to reasonable accommodation?
Yes, most employers are likely already doing this in some fashion. This is training about a person's right to reasonable accommodation if they are a qualified applicant or employee with a disability. And so this applies to the hiring process, performing the job, and accessing those privileges that come with employment. This training on the right to reasonable accommodation is usually a part of onboarding training, and so that's important to continue with, and it's great, but we do want to be mindful that employees are receiving so much information during onboarding that sometimes the message can be lost. So it may be best to supplement this training by providing this on an ongoing basis for all of your employees. What this does is helps all of your employees remain aware of their right to reasonable accommodation. And that's important because not all employees with disabilities need an accommodation, and sometimes they don't need an accommodation until something changes. And that change can be either with the disability or the work environment. And then some of us may acquire a disability as we age or if we have an injury. And so if we continually provide this training when an employee with a disability needs a reasonable accommodation, he or she will remember this right to request one. This training can also help an employee with a disability understand how to make a request because you likely will include your contact information. And it also helps all of your employees to understand that other coworkers may be making requests for accommodations and that this kind of request is confidential. You also might want to support this training with information that you include in your employee handbooks, in your company intranet, in your company newsletter. These are just ways to keep this information in front of your employees so they remain aware. One great benefit of this kind of training is that it does send a message to all of your employees that you care about them and what they might need to do the job.
Right, Julie, and that message ultimately contributes to all employees feeling included at work. Okay, the second type of training is for supervisors. There was a research study conducted by Cornell University that revealed employees with disabilities are at least 60% more likely to disclose their disability to a supervisor than to human resources.
That's right, and it makes sense. We are familiar with our supervisors and may just feel more comfortable talking with them than figuring out who in human resources to call or email. And we may not feel comfortable to leave our work area to go to the human resources office to ask about an accommodation. And so because of this, it's very helpful to provide training for all of your supervisors. And I would like to highlight 4 different topics that I think are important to address in that training. The first one is about how to recognize a request for an accommodation, because this can actually be very simple, and because of that, it's easy to overlook. A request for an accommodation really just needs to mention a barrier in the workplace, or it needs to include a request for a change at work, and these need to be related to a disability or a health condition. And so a request for an accommodation doesn't have to reference the Americans with Disabilities Act or use the word reasonable accommodation. I'd like to share some examples of a request for an accommodation from the EEOC guidance. So if an employee tells his supervisor, "I'm having trouble getting to work at my scheduled starting time because of medical treatments I'm undergoing," this is an example of a request for an accommodation. Also, if an employee tells his supervisor, "I need 6 weeks off work to get treatment for a back problem," this is also a request for an accommodation. If a new employee tells her supervisor that her wheelchair will not fit under her desk in her office, this is also a request for a reasonable accommodation. Now, I'd like to share what is not a request for an accommodation. If an employee tells his supervisor he would like a new chair because his present chair is uncomfortable, this is not a request because it does not link the need for the change with a medical condition. Another aspect of training that's important to include for supervisors includes what steps you want the supervisor to take when they receive the request, who they should contact, or where they should direct the employee. Because once a disclosure is made about disability or a medical condition, it then becomes a confidential matter. And so it's important to know if the supervisor is permitted to have this confidential conversation, or if he or she should direct the employee to human resources to continue the discussion. The next aspect of training that is helpful is to address confidentiality rules regarding medical information and disability and reasonable accommodations. So the supervisors should be aware that these are confidential matters and be aware to follow the guidelines that you have on directing the employee to human resources, as well as to understand that they are not necessarily permitted to know about the medical information or the disability related information, but they are permitted to know about any specifics with implementing an accommodation or just the presence of an accommodation. And then the final aspect that's important to include in this kind of training is how you want your supervisors to respond to coworkers that may ask questions about a colleague's reasonable accommodation. So sometimes a disability is invisible, but the reasonable accommodation is not, and that will lead to coworkers asking because they might perceive that a colleague is receiving special treatment and they want to know why, or can they get that special treatment as well. And so supervisors field these kinds of questions. And so by addressing how you want them to respond, it can help them during those moments. Now, we provided a training on navigating the reasonable accommodation process that does go into more detail about how to respond and addresses these topics on reasonable accommodations requests in more depth. And so I would invite you to review that training that we have archived on our website for more information. And then I just want to point out, we mentioned one of the types of trainings that you can provide to all of your employees is about their right to reasonable accommodation and how this will help everybody be aware that these are confidential matters. So this might curtail some of the questions that supervisors get, but it's likely they still will field these questions, so it's important to help them understand how to respond.
Thanks, Julie. And I imagine supervisors would welcome that kind of training because you're right. And studies do show they are likely to be the first person an employee with a disability discloses to and asks about an accommodation. So the last training is for all employees. When reasonable accommodations are implemented, this can sometimes lead to employees discussing the employee with a disability, which has the potential to lead to gossip and harassment. Certainly, one best practice is to provide education on proper communications in the workplace for all employees. But what other trainings do you think is helpful?
Dennis, it's a best practice to be proactive and provide training for all of your employees about disability awareness. Our business relations team does offer this kind of training at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. We offer this to employers at no cost. And our training on disability awareness and disability etiquette is really designed to deliver this information in a way that is geared toward making everyone feel more comfortable and included at work. And while this training is absolutely beneficial for everyone, it's especially helpful for hiring professionals who conduct interviews. So it can help an interviewer to understand that behaviors they may observe from an applicant, such as lack of eye contact or a flat affect, which is a lack of emotional expression, these can be characteristics of certain types of disabilities. For example, an applicant with autism may display decreased eye contact during an interview, but this doesn't mean the applicant isn't interested in the job or engaged with the interviewer. Or an applicant who takes a medication to treat a mental health condition may display a flat affect, but it doesn't mean the applicant is not enthusiastic about the job. So being aware of these characteristics helps interviewers to focus on the applicant's ability to do the job and prevents them from overlooking a qualified applicant. The training also helps interviewers understand that each person is unique, and so how a disability impacts a person will also be unique.
Thanks, Julie. So earlier this year, we delivered a webinar called Disability Etiquette Training. So if you didn't have a chance to tune in to that, we do have that archived along with our other trainings. Okay, on to the next accessibility resolution, number 4. Ensure application process is accessible. Many employers have applicants apply for their open positions through an online application system.
You're right, Dennis. That is a very common way that employers receive applications from interested candidates. And we talked earlier about how employers want to expand their recruiting efforts to include qualified candidates with disabilities. And we talked about what to think of for making the recruitment process more accessible. So it made sense to include making the application process accessible as one of our resolutions, because once you recruit a qualified candidate, you want them to be able to complete the application process without barriers. So it can be helpful to be aware of what to look for to know whether your current system is accessible, so it is easily accessed by everyone. We provided a training I've referenced a few times called Inclusive Hiring that did focus on applicants with disabilities, and it goes into this topic in much more detail. And so we do invite you to view that for your reference. But I wanted to give you some examples now of areas that you can review for your own site's accessibility. The first one is to ensure or check that it is compatible with screen reading software and that your visual content includes alternative text. Also, look at your audio material and see if it's providing captions to convey that information in another way. And also, look to see that your content is created in a way that's organized and not cluttered, and design the navigation of the site for keyboard navigation. I, in the past, have provided a consult with an employer partner who wanted to learn more about this topic and how to assess their own online application site. And so we worked together and I was able to collect information and resources, which I organized into a formal report for the employer to reference. And it included information about how to test your own site for accessibility, information on how to make the site accessible if it's not. And then we also identified some vendors that the employer could reach out to and talk with further in case they didn't have the in-house expertise to make these changes. And so that's an example of one way I can provide a worksite accessibility consultation for an employer partner.
Great, thanks, Julie, and for all those quick tips. Okay, on to the next accessibility resolution, number 3. Be open to new ideas. So, Julie, this sounds intriguing. What do you mean by this resolution?
Well, sometimes we all get stuck thinking there is only one way to do things simply because that's how we've always done them, right? And if 2020 has taught us nothing else, it's that certainly many things can be done in a new way. So if we apply this concept to accessibility, this is really what the interactive process and the identification of a reasonable accommodation require of us. because a reasonable accommodation is a change in the workplace that enables an employee with a disability to perform the job just in another way. So it's very important to be open to new ideas, and that's why I have included this as an accessibility resolution. I thought it would be helpful and fun to discuss how a reasonable accommodation can be successful in performing the job in a new way. And so I have several examples I'd like to share to illustrate this. Some of these are from my own experience and some I have borrowed from other resources.
Julie, I think examples are always helpful. And I know you will be sharing some products with us all, so I just want to remind everyone that OOD does not endorse products or vendors, but we wanted to share these ideas because we feel these examples are very helpful. I know your first example is about an employee with a disability that experiences a limitation with remembering the steps to follow in making a cleaning solution at work. What reasonable accommodation was implemented in this situation?
Dennis, for this employee, the reasonable accommodation that was successful included creating a laminated poster that listed each step in the process in both pictures and words, and then hanging the instructions on the wall right where the task takes place. This change helped the employee follow the proper steps to make the cleaning solution correctly.
So what's really exciting about that example, Julie, is I bet once this was implemented, it actually made the work task easier for all employees that make the cleaning solution, which makes the work environment more accessible for everyone.
Dennis, you're right. And because it's right there in the environment as a visual reminder, it may also result in all employees making fewer errors. So it really has multiple benefits.
Absolutely. Okay, up next is an example of an actual client you worked with who was a chef who was deaf and was working in a commercial kitchen. He was unable to hear the auditory alarm that indicated the bread he was baking was finished, so he was burning the bread. What reasonable accommodation did you find?
He was burning the bread, Dennis, and this really concerned him because he enjoyed his job. He had been at his job for many years, and his condition had progressed from being hard of hearing to being deaf, and he was concerned about losing his job. What we implemented was a visual timer in place of the auditory alarm, similar to the one you see in the PowerPoint slide that has the black frame, the white background. The timer can be set for an hour, and then there's a red shaded area that indicates the amount of time that is left. He was able then to place the bread in the oven and set this visual timer and place it within his view in his workstation so he could see when time was up. All he had to do was be mindful to look at the timer as he was doing his other tasks, which he was able to do, and this was successful. And this timer cost less than $23.
And that's well below the typical cost of $500, so that's great. So your next example involves a maintenance worker who is working with a physical disability that resulted from a shoulder injury.
Yes, he was a maintenance worker in a small facility, so he was the only maintenance worker, which meant he didn't have a coworker to share tasks with. And again, because this is a small facility, anything that could remotely fall under the category of maintenance did. So when I was working with him, the task he was completing was remodeling a room, which included hanging cabinets and handling plywood, both of which were difficult for him to do with this shoulder condition. So the first item we implemented is called a cabinet jack, and we included a picture of this in the PowerPoint slide. It shows how 2 cabinet jacks are placed underneath a cabinet to secure it in the correct place, so the worker had both arms and hands free to securely drill the cabinet to the wall. And this worked well for him, and the cost for these 2 was under $72.
That looks like an item that could come in handy for everyone who hangs cabinets, so good find. And again, this is under the typical cost of $500 as well. So Julie, you also mentioned this employee handled plywood?
Yes, so he would go to the storage area to get the plywood and then bring it back to the room that he was remodeling. Now, if you are familiar with plywood, you know it isn't necessarily the weight of it that makes maneuvering it a challenge, but it's the size and the shape of it. So to handle it, you have to outstretch your arms away from the body, which makes it feel like it weighs more than it does. And it makes our arms and muscles less efficient in handling the load. What I found is called a Gorilla Gripper. It's $29.95, and we have it pictured here on the PowerPoint slide. It's basically a black handle that adheres to both sides of the plywood, and the picture shows just the arm of a person holding the gripper with the elbow bent and the upper arm against the side of the body. So this way, the arm is close to the body, making the muscles more efficient. And this worked well for the maintenance worker, so he was able to maneuver the plywood from where it was stacked in the storage room and either place it on a cart to push it to the room he was remodeling, or he was also able to use this gripper to carry it the distance as well.
Another great find, and again, well below the typical cost of $500. So Julie, in your next example is about an auto mechanic instructor who, due to a hip replacement and low back condition, was having a difficult time instructing students on some of the tasks he was teaching them, one of which was mounting a tire onto a vehicle.
Yes, so the customary way this task was being performed was this. The vehicles in the shop being worked on were placed on a lift in a bay and then elevated to a specific height to be able to be worked on by the instructor or the student. Typically, a student or the instructor would get a tire from the storage area where they're placed on a rack near floor level, and they kind of roll the tire off the rack and then they roll it across the shop floor to the bay where they're going to mount the tire to a particular vehicle. And so what they do is they lift the tire from the ground level up to the proper height to mount it onto the vehicle. What we were able to implement successfully was a portable tire lift that the instructor could push to the storage area, roll the tire onto it, and then roll the lift with the tire to the vehicle. And then the lift had the ability to be elevated, so the wheel could be lifted to the proper height through the mechanism, so that all the instructor really had to do was manipulate the tire from the lift to the vehicle instead of lifting it from the floor level, which he was able to do. And so we have this pictured here. You can see it's a blue frame. It's got casters on the supports on the bottom, and it shows the tire elevated to a waist height approximately position. And the cost of this is $595.
Thanks, Julie. So I imagine this is an item that might benefit everyone and possibly could result in preventing injuries, which might make it an economical choice to implement for all employees to use. And this is a good time to remind everyone of those outside funding sources and tax benefits that are available to offset some of the cost of accommodations. And this may be a good example of the importance of creating the centralized accommodation fund. So, Julie, you found an example of a reasonable accommodation that could benefit a food service worker with low vision.
Yes, this example shows how the concept of color contrast can help an employee with low vision be able to see the work task of cutting vegetables for food preparation in a commercial kitchen. So what we've pictured in the PowerPoint slide is a cutting board that is black on one side and white on the other side. It has a picture on it showing a yellow pepper on the black side and a red pepper on the white side. Now, which colors contrast better to improve vision will be unique to each person. However, this board gives us one example of how applying contrast to the work task can improve the employee's ability to see the work task and be successful in performing the job. This particular cutting board is listed at $12.95.
So Julie, the concept of contrast is a great strategy to bring up because that can apply to your print materials and to your electronic documents. I know we pay attention to contrast when we create our PowerPoint slides. This next example is one that came to us from the Job Accommodation Network, and it includes an employee who is working as a freezer operator and has low vision. He is having a difficult time seeing visual notifications that are in print format. The employee provided a reasonable accommodation in the form of a portable handheld magnifier the employee could carry with him and use for those items he was having a difficult time reading. Julie, I know there is something specific about this example you wanted to share with us.
Yes, so we have pictured here in the PowerPoint a handheld magnifier that's called Ruby. Its list price is $545. What I wanted to highlight about this particular reasonable accommodation is that this is an example of an item that is available to borrow from the lending libraries we talked about earlier. So this might be something you want to borrow first to determine if it will be effective before you purchase it.
That is a great point to make. And thank you for sharing an example of how the lending libraries can be a benefit for all employers. I know we have a couple more examples to share. In this next example, which is also from the Job Accommodation Network, an employee is working as a building inspector and he is deaf. He has requested an accommodation for communicating during training and when having conversations in the field with coworkers. So what reasonable accommodations were implemented?
So the solution for this employee was twofold. The first reasonable accommodation, which addressed communications during training, was to provide a sign language interpreter. And then for those conversations the employee was having with coworkers in the field, the employee was provided with a mobile device, which he could use to text his coworkers to communicate. And so both of these accommodations worked well for him. What I'd like to point out about sign language interpretation is that there are times that the type of communication you are having needs to be accommodated by having a sign language interpreter. And this includes communications during the interview, training, lengthy meetings, and conferences. And so this brings up a good point that this accommodation can be an ongoing need for an employee. And so it's one example of why we have tax benefits, such as the disabled access credit, so that providing this kind of accommodation on an ongoing basis when it is needed is more affordable for a small business.
Absolutely, Julie. Okay, our last example that will help remind us all to be open to new ideas is another example from the Job Accommodation Network. This example is about an employee working as a scientist who has autism with an intermittent speech limitation. This employee requested a reasonable accommodation to enable him to deliver a presentation at an upcoming conference. So what was implemented for this employee?
The employee was permitted to pre-record some of the audio content for some of the slides in his presentation. And then he was also provided a tablet that included a speech generating application that he could use when he needed it to answer questions he received from the audience.
So those sound like great ideas, and all of these examples really do show that there is more than one way to perform a job task most of the time. Okay, on to next accessibility resolution, number 2. Establish criteria for reasonable and undue hardship. I know employers are probably wondering, when I am collaborating with an employee with a disability and identifying options for accommodations, how do I determine what is reasonable or what causes an undue hardship?
Yes, that's a popular question and why it made the list of our top 10 accessibility resolutions. And there's not just one specific answer. It really does require a case-by-case analysis. As we referenced earlier, studies do show that 56% of accommodations are free, and those that were not had a typical cost of $500. So based on these studies, most of the time accommodations are going to be reasonable. However, there may be a time when you identify an effective option and you feel it is too costly, and you may be right. But making that determination that the reasonable accommodation causes an undue hardship requires more than an opinion. The EEOC indicates an employer should perform a case-by-case assessment to determine undue hardship, and it does offer some guidance and criteria on what to consider when you do. So this includes factors like the cost and nature of the accommodation in relation to the specifics about your organization, like what size of an employer you are, what your financial resources are you part of a larger entity, what type of operation do you have, and how would the accommodation impact your operations. And when it's the cost of the accommodation that is in question, you want to consider the net cost after applying any of the outside sources of funding that we discussed, such as tax benefits that you may be eligible for. And if you want additional information on assessing undue hardship, we did cover this a little bit more in the archived training called Navigating the Reasonable Accommodation Process.
Thank you, Julie. Now on to our final accessibility resolution, number 1. Create a reasonable accommodation statement. Julie, I know we aren't supposed to play favorites, but I do think this is your favorite accessibility resolution. Can you tell us why?
Well, Dennis, all of these accessibility resolutions are important, and all of the accessibility best practices we've shared in our previous webinars are also important. But there are a few reasons I highlight the reasonable accommodation statement in all of our trainings and why I've placed it in our #1 slot here today. The reason I think this statement is so important is because despite all the great efforts we are all making to create work environments that are accessible, if an individual with a disability encounters a barrier to accessing the hiring process or participating in a work-related activity, we want that person to feel comfortable in letting us know and in requesting an accommodation. That way we can remove the barrier and the person can access the work-related activity. The other main reason I wanted to highlight this in the #1 slot for accessibility resolutions is because when we include a reasonable accommodation statement, it's one very important way that employers can communicate to all applicants and employees their commitment to being a workplace that is inclusive of individuals with disabilities.
You are right. A reasonable accommodation statement is very important and very powerful in making everyone feel included. So what should this statement include and where should it be included?
Well, this statement informs applicants and employees with disabilities of their right to request a reasonable accommodation and how to do so. So it's important to include contact information. And the places you want to include this statement are in your job postings, in your application forms, both online and in person, in your reasonable accommodation policies, in your employee handbooks, in your company intranet, and also in your invitations to interviews, onboarding, meetings, trainings, and conferences. And you want to make this statement easy to find in all of these places where you're including it. We did provide examples of reasonable accommodation statements in the Learner's Guide if that's helpful for you to reference.
Thanks. Examples are always helpful. Okay, let's take our final break and see what questions have come in. So Julie, our first question, how much money do you suggest to set aside in the enterprise-wide fund for a reasonable accommodation?
Well, if that question is about how much to set aside for each individual reasonable accommodation, I would either take an average of what you've provided in the past. Because these studies show us that reasonable accommodations are often $500 or less, you could use that number. We do not want to suggest that 500 is in any way a cutoff for what's reasonable or an undue hardship, because that assessment will be unique to each employer. And we discussed there's different factors that you look at. If you're looking at what the total budget should be, then again, we shared some examples of how other employers arrived at this decision. I think the simplest way to do it is look at what your aggregate budget has been that you've spent over the past 5 to 10 years and get an annual average. And I think that's a good place to start.
Great advice. The next question, is the state's online application system accessible?
The answer to that is yes. However, there are times that there are barriers that can't be anticipated. And so we still have a reasonable accommodation statement, because when you build something to be accessible for everyone, you base that on guidelines. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be accessible in every single situation. And that's going to be the case with everything we all do. And so that's why, yes, we've made efforts to make it as accessible as we're aware of. However, we also include that statement in case there is a situation where it's not accessible and there is a barrier. That individual knows exactly how to reach out to us to let us know, so we can remove that barrier and look at an accommodation that's reasonable.
Perfect. And that again is all the time we have for questions. Okay, Julie, I know you have some final thoughts you'd like to share with us before we close.
Yes, so before we conclude today, I would like to extend a challenge. Now, this challenge is voluntary, it's not mandatory, but I would like to invite everyone to pick one of the accessibility resolutions that we've discussed today and tell us which one you would like to work to achieve in 2021. And if you could include that in your evaluation for today's training, we would greatly appreciate that. In January, we will begin a 5-part webinar series that's called the Employer's ADA Handbook. And so in the beginning of that first webinar in January, I will announce the top 3 accessibility resolutions that were submitted for 2021. Now, I will not share names or companies. We'll keep that confidential, but the top 3 resolutions we're going to announce in the beginning of that training. And so with that, I would just like to thank you all for attending today's training and for your continued interest in creating workplaces that are diverse and inclusive of employees with disabilities. And we welcome the opportunity to continue to partner with you in 2021 with the many services that we have to offer employers.